Thank you, Dr. Jaber. I wanted to speak about my experiences. I'm not Muslim. I'm an interfaith minister. I've been part of the staff of, wonderful experience of being part of the staff of PSI since, for 16 years. And it was about the same time also that I started working with the Arab American Association of New York and several other of the groups that at that time were serving the Muslim community in New York. I had the privilege of working with a clinical psychologist named Dr. Suha Nikowitz, who was part of the association, and also in the early days, your partner, Basma Atwe, who was a social worker that actually created the Arab American Association of New York. So really from the very first day, there was a recognition of the partnership of the community and the support and the advocacy and the healing and the need for some mental health support. In the early days, through a grant with PSI, Suha and I would go to the association once a week. At that point, Dr. Jaber had his pediatric practice downstairs. Obstetrics, I'm sorry, obstetrics. Yes, there were many babies born. All those pictures of all those babies. Everyone in this community has a relative who was delivered by Dr. Jaber. But the association at that point was one small room with a few volunteers and a handful of students. It now has a couple of dozen staff and 24 staff. And we have several hundred students who come to learn ESL, to become citizens. And what Suha and I did in the early days, we were working around issues of trauma, around issues of self-care, around issues of well-being, domestic violence. And as the population grew and changed, so did our work. I have a background in creative arts therapy, and I do not speak Arabic. Suha did speak Arabic, and we were partnered in working with mostly women in the beginning, now more men, who were learning English, and I would use the arts as another form of expression. And we had a kind of magical experiences and watched the population change and grow from women. Many of the women in the early days were from Palestine, and we're still recovering from the early traumas of the war, and we're an older generation. Over the years, the population changed to be more and more women from Yemen, and then recently Yemen and Syria and Egypt and many, many, many countries. And I often ask myself, here I am, a Methodist interfaith minister whose father was a German Jew, living on one side of Brooklyn, traveling across to the other side of Brooklyn every Monday morning. What was I doing that for? And just the showing up and the learning that I experienced from this community, and the deep love and respect, and also my feeling like I somehow owed something given the traumas that their countries were facing, and even right here in New York, some of the backlash that this community was facing. If I could just show up and learn and say, I want to know who you are, and I want to help you express yourself in whatever way possible. I said to them last week at our last graduation, you are my teachers. There's great reverence for teachers in this community, and there's amazing commitment. I work with groups of women, and as I said, more recently also men, who show up after arriving in this country, maybe being here for 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, show up for 5 hours a day, 4 to 5 hours a week to learn English and form community. And I don't know many other people around New York City who have that level of commitment for belonging and growth. So there were, when I started doing this work, I called it community, caring, creativity, and conversation. I love the C's. As a kind of poet, I'm a great wordsmither, and I love alliteration. So I worked with those, and then I discovered that they had more to teach me about community, creativity, caring, and conversation than I had to teach them. And I came away with some other words that brought me back across Brooklyn every week. And that was my awe at their resilience and relationship and resonance with one another, coming from very different backgrounds. I mean, we sometimes, as we do with people, look at particularly women with hijabs and make assumptions about them all being the same. But I know this community that comes from many, many different countries and cultures, and Moroccan food and Moroccan chicken with rice is not the same as I've been taught as Yemenis. Food. Dr. Jaber mentioned food. I've never known a community, maybe with the exception of my Southern Methodist church, where food was such a foundational source of coming together and healing, and generosity and giving, and celebration that life goes on. I was listening to something about trauma the other day, talking about communities recovering from shooters, from these mass shootings that we have had. And they talked about understanding our range of resilience, understanding the range of resilience that's available in individuals and that's available in a community. And I have learned so much about what it means to be resilient. And this notion of relationship to one another, as people come together in these classes, the way the community greets one another. Ma'asalam, may peace be with you. Every single time. I mean, we say hi, hello, or how you doing, but may peace be with you. And thinking about that resonance of, we do this in many different traditions. We pass the peace in our churches. But that resonance of doing that every single time you meet someone, coupled with what Dr. Jaber was sharing about this sense of returning to that place of knowing that it's going to be okay, knowing that there's another possibility. And the relationship among people and community and family is so primary. When I met with groups of women over the last several months and asked them the same questions that we've just been discussing. And the place they said they turned were three places. One is to their relationships with one another, with family. Really, really primary. One of the women, we were talking about our arrival stories and what we felt really comfortable about being in Brooklyn, being in New York, being here in this country, and what was uncomfortable. And one woman said, I love being here. I'm so happy. I'm so grateful that I'm here and I'm safe. But one thing I don't understand is I've been living with my in-laws for 3 months and we've hardly ever had dinner together. What's that about? Don't people in America eat with their families? And that was just that question said something to me because it's so primary. It's so primary. And we do this in our communities of faith. We get together for meals, but we've lost so much of that in our everyday life, in our culture. So this sense of relationship with community, with family, with one another, no matter where you came from, and primarily the relationship with God, is that knowing you can always be held in that relationship with God, and the regularity of the everyday practice of that. So that what they said is, that real experience of taking it to God in prayer. So I looked at my little alliterations and I realized that in this talk I had a whole bunch of P's. First of all, being praying 5 times a day. And I know my classes will break for people to pray, my groups, my sessions. And I consider myself a pretty deeply spiritual person, and I've served as a pastor, I've been part of many different faith traditions. I don't pray 5 times a day. I have my little practices, but they're private and personal and not public and shared. And one of the things that the women talked about was that experience not only of the connection of the relationship to God and taking the trouble, the trauma, that thing that's broken their reality, and bringing it to God 5 times a day, but also the physical act of the movement of prayer, of going down to the floor, of letting your head touch the floor. Now there are many other faith traditions that have similar practices. They said it's like your yoga, but the experience of the release of tension and anxiety in that practice. The other one thing that was talked about was patience. And I know you and I had a conversation about patience, and I hear patience and, what did somebody say? Patience is a virtue seldom found in women, never found in men, I once heard. But patience, in a deeper sense than we're used to talking about. We're a very impatient culture. We want, when things happen, we want them fixed. We want them fixed now. We also can fall into that in the evolution of our psychotherapy, which I've been able to watch, is this notion from being relational and being with and being patient to we've got to find the right method to make the quick fix. So what I see in hearing the women talk about patience is this sense of being able to survive incredible adversity. For many, leaving your country, seeing your village, your neighbors, homes and houses destroyed, seeing your relatives killed, not knowing whether you're ever going to see your mother or your children again. It was so interesting that what they talked about in relation to that was patience. Patience. Being able to take one day at a time and be patient. Being able to show up every day for 5 hours to learn a very difficult language in what might feel like a relatively hostile environment, and be patient. So I have come to understand a whole nother depth of meaning of this word, patience. The other, and Dr. Jaber talked a little bit about this, was impermanence. How this life is a small piece of existence, and everything is impermanent. And having been studied Buddhism for many years, as I got deeper into that conversation, I started to see a lot of parallels around that in this sense, which our next session in May will talk about some of the Buddhist principles and Christian principles. But I started to see some parallels that I never thought of before about this sense of impermanence, and impermanence as a coping mechanism with, if we look at the definition of trauma being something that breaks your reality as you know it, we tend to have a very tight reality in our culture, that things are always supposed to work, and if they don't work, you just read another magazine article and it will tell you the 5 ways to make it work. So we're very susceptible to having our reality broken. And there's been a lot of work, and people will talk more about this, about what happens to us neurologically in trauma. And, but this sense of, I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, this sense of patience and knowing that all is impermanent creates space, creates a sense of spaciousness, which I have so experienced in working, and such openness to different possibilities and different conversations. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, if I can wrap this in pretty quickly, is this power of positive thinking. And I'll pair that with the openness to positive outcomes, which we've heard a lot talk about in some of the recovery conversations I've heard around the shooting disasters that have happened recently, is being able to hold space for the possibility of positive outcomes. And Dr. Jaber referenced that a little bit. And I find that to be a very, very powerful force in this community, in all the work that we've done. A lot of the work I do with art is both through poetry and through visual art, is both documenting some of the pain, having a place to put it visually, but also documenting the vision of what's possible. And I found that the openness to doing that is very, very available, even relative to other populations of people I've worked with. I've worked a lot in cancer care. I've worked a lot with immigrants from other countries. And I find that this power to take the bad thing and be patient enough to see the growth possibility show up from it is also very parallel to some Buddhist teachings of, the old story about the man who gets the horse, and isn't that wonderful, you won this brand new horse. Well, his son falls off of it the next day and breaks his back and is in the hospital. Oh, isn't that terrible? What a horrible thing to happen. And then the next day, then down the road, he falls in love with the nurse that took care of him. Oh, isn't that wonderful? And such goes life. And that part of what I've been hearing in some of the conversations about trauma is the possibility of this positive growth outcome coming out of the negative. The one other thing that the women spoke of very powerfully was the Quran as a source. And in all our faith traditions, we turn to our scriptures. We turn to the stories of our scriptures. We turn to the metaphors in our scriptures, which I've also found in working poetically is a very, metaphor and imagery is very, very powerful tool. But we also, one of the other things that was talked about, and this is the last point I will make, is the sound of the Quran as a healing modality. And if we look into different faith traditions, the sound, whether it's Hindu chanting or the cantor or hearing recitations in Latin, we have come to know that resonance and sound and vibration can be healing. I had the privilege of living in Indonesia for a while, where I lived across the street from a mosque, and I was woken up every morning by the call to prayer. And it became, when I stopped having that in the mornings, I really missed it, because it was such a grounding resonance in my body and my mind and my spirit. So these are just some of the things that I've come to learn and understand through my years and the gift of working in this community. And I'm just honored by the privilege. And I think the one thing I would say, particularly I would second what Dr. Jaber said about coming to really know the resourcefulness and things that are often seen in the faith, particularly the women wearing the hijabs. My sense has, knowing this community intimately over the years, that is a place of power and purpose and strength and a source of identity and a source of what lives beyond whatever happens. I had one woman who was a student I knew for a number of years, who had several young children and was learning English through their homework, and lovely, lovely woman. And the only thing she had showing were her eyes. She was in complete covering. And she said, I see how people look at me when I walk down the street. So every morning I go to the mirror and I practice smiling the love I have inside me out into the world, so they will know that they don't need to be afraid.